Hello and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. Earlier this year, the Prince of Wales announced plans to build 24 homes on his Duchy of Cornwall land to provide temporary accommodation for homeless people in Nansledan. The project will be delivered with help and support from local homelessness charity St Petrocs. It reflects the commitment and compassion Prince William has shown to the UK's homeless since he became Centrepoint's royal patron as a young man, following in Princess Diana's footsteps. My guest today is a trustee of St Petrocs, lives in Cornwall with his family, and has devoted much of his life to making a tangible difference to those who end up sleeping rough, surviving life on the streets and in the doorways of Britain. Jon Sparkes works at the sharp end of the charity sector. He's run major organisations, including National Homelessness Charity Crisis, during which time he was on the UK government's Rough Sleeping Advisory Panel and at the forefront of groundbreaking work. He's currently Chief Executive of UNICEF UK, but is leaving soon to lead Mencap, which champions people with learning disabilities, pushing for change. Jon, it really is lovely to meet you. Thank you for making time. You really have been at the helm of organisations which make life-changing differences to those who don't always have a voice and perhaps find themselves at rock bottom. What made you want to get involved in this work and the charity sector in the first place?
I get out of bed in the morning because I worried about marginalised groups and people who are just having a really rubbish time. And the organisations I've been fortunate to lead work with people in exactly that position. I've asked myself a few times why I've ended up in this kind of work. And actually, there's a formative experience I had as a child. My great fortune was that I lived in the same house for 18 years as a child. It was a council house in North Nottinghamshire. It was a semi-detached house. And next door to me lived a boy called Paul, who was exactly the same age as me. Same house, same socioeconomics, everything the same. Born only a few days apart. And we only had one difference between us. Paul had Down syndrome. And our lives started out exactly the same and diverged every single day of those 18 years to be totally different now. And, I went off to university and I got a great job as a human resources person. I ended up in a great high-tech company, but something inside said, actually, it's not good enough. And it's not good enough for Paul. It's not good enough for me. And I wanted to go do something about it. And that's how I ended up moving to Scope, the disability charity, and started out 20 years of incredibly exciting, incredibly frustrating, and incredibly rewarding work.
Gosh, yes, frustrating and rewarding. We'll come to that in a minute. Are there any particular memories that stand out from those early days when you were living next door to your friend?
Preschool, we were the same. We would play together. We would do woodwork together with our balsa wood woodwork kits. My brother would take Paul swimming, and then we went to school. And Paul went to a different school. I only saw him at the weekends and the evenings. And then I went to secondary school, which meant for me a 10-mile bus journey to secondary school. And Paul went to another different school. And then I didn't even see him in the evenings. I just saw him at the weekends. Then I went to university and he didn't. And I don't know what happened after that, but I do know our lives would be very, very different, but started in exactly the same place.
And in a way, perhaps you're coming a little bit full circle, because here we are today at UNICEF UK, and I think June, you're off to Mencap. And Mencap really does champion people with learning disabilities. I've been fortunate enough to do quite a few projects with people with learning disabilities. And when you see what they're capable of and how their opportunities are just not always there, it's heartbreaking.
It's one of the almost hidden marginalised groups left. I mean, many marginalised groups become talked about in public more, quite healthily. We all talk about mental health much more than we ever used to. We talk about all sorts of inequalities. What we rarely hear anyone talking about is the 1.5 million people with a learning disability in the UK and their life expectancy. They will expect to live 20 years less than their non-disabled counterparts. 5% of people with a learning disability have a job. 80% of people with a learning disability want a job. Those levels of inequality, and we're not talking about it enough, and it's 1.5 million people. And you see people in films, you see in Spain, there's an MP. I think I saw today the news of someone graduating. So you see examples of people with a learning disability doing the things that everybody else does. But then you also see people with a learning disability who need quite intensive support in order to be able to function in their communities. And, surely we owe it to people to give them the support they need to at least be treated, the same dreams, the same aspirations, the same experiences, the same highs and lows of life as everybody else. So I'm really looking forward to Mencap. I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are people treated in an appalling way. At the moment, there are 2,000 people with a learning disability who can't get out of mental health hospitals because the support isn't available in the community for those people. They're people with a learning disability, not people with a serious mental health issue. They shouldn't even be there, and they're waiting to be allowed out. And that's in 2024. So lots to be done.
Lots to be done, but also I know that obviously you'll have lots of ideas and new things you want to do at Mencap, but is a lot of it about a change in policy? How reliant are these changes in government support, and at a time when one would imagine we may be having a change of government at the end of the year?
Absolutely. And it's both. And I think, the common link between some of the organisations I've worked for and with has been the combination of practical support for people who need it with policy influence and policy development. And I think with Mencap, it's no different. Mencap itself provides support, direct support for about 5,000 people with a learning disability. The network of local Mencaps around the country supports about another 30,000 people. But there are 1.5 million people with a learning disability, and it's policy changes which in the end will make the difference. Access to healthcare, the ability to get to see a GP, the ability to communicate and be advocated for with health professionals. All of these things require not necessarily, deep policy changes, but investment in the right place, and investment that follows policies that says those people have the same rights as everybody else, but need a bit more help in order to achieve that. And policy, particularly around social care funding. There's approximately £7 billion less being spent on social care in the UK now than a decade ago. And that shows, and it shows in the services the local authorities are able to commission. It shows in the salaries that people who provide essential frontline support are able to earn or able to be paid. It shows in many, many ways, and Mencap and a lot of other organisations across the disability field, across the age charities, are looking for that to be corrected. And of course, it's not going to be corrected overnight, but really important that if we start with a framework that says people with whatever support needs have a right to that support, and then make sure that the investment follows those rights, that's the sort of coherent framework we need. We can all shout for more money, but let's shout for a coherent framework that delivers that money to do the right things and support people in the right way. I've met someone recently who is supported by Mencap. A few years ago, when they started to be supported by Mencap, they came to us from the NHS. They had to have 5 members of staff supporting them at any one time. They now, today, have 2 members of staff supporting them because actually their frustrations and their needs have been lowered by really good professional and caring support. So, that's good for the professional development of the staff. It's good for the person that we support, and it's good for the public purse. And if we can link those things between practice and policy, we stand a chance of achieving change.
I think what's really clear, Jon, speaking to you for only just a few minutes, is that obviously you've got the talent and skill for the big pieces and the framework, but you haven't lost touch with people on the ground, because what's feeding your drive and enthusiasm, I'd like to say, I think, is individual people who really need help.
Absolutely it is. I have literally, because I haven't joined Mencap yet, I've only met 10 people that Mencap support. But what incredible rich characters living fulfilling lives with a bit of support, a bit of help with communication, a bit of help with daily tasks, whatever it is they need. But rich characters. I spoke to someone who regularly calls into the sort of local radio station political chat show. I've spoken to someone who just likes nothing better than walking into town and going around the shops and just normal stuff. But it's normal stuff that only works if they've got the support they need. Otherwise, they're in a hospital. Otherwise, they're isolated. But with a bit of support, they get to where they need to. And it's been the same whether it's been learning disability or homelessness. I remember at the times at Crisis, every single day I was talking to people who were, we called our clients members at Crisis. It was a support community, so they were members trying to achieve something rather than clients or service users or anything else. But every single day there was an interchange with someone who was using our services. And I just don't think you can do big policy unless you're with the small people and one of the small people, and then you can do big policy.
Tell us about the homelessness crisis in the UK and also Cornwall.
So, I mean, in the UK for decades, we haven't built enough houses. When I said at the start, my great privilege in life was to have had the same council house for 18 years. And that gave me a platform in life, which I know today my parents would have been in a series of private rentals. We'd have moved from one place to another. There wouldn't have been an availability. If they hadn't have been able to pay the rent, we'd have ended up in a hotel room. And who knows whether us as their kids would have even been with them in those circumstances. And instead, we had 18 years of real stability in a council house. And for decades, we haven't built houses that people can afford. And we've managed to coin phrases like affordable housing, which aren't affordable, instead of just getting on and building social homes, council houses, housing associations, social homes that give people a step up and stability. And if you put that alongside the erosion of the sort of social security safety net, we've created through policy a homelessness disaster. And we see it again. And the thing with homelessness, if you look at the numbers over the decades, you see times when homelessness reduces and you see times when homelessness increases, and you follow the policies and it's driven by that. I mean, homelessness is an incredibly complex personal thing, but it's a very simple policy thing. That having enough homes and a decent safety net, you don't get as much homelessness. And there were times, I think the early 2000s, where the number of people rough sleeping in London was down to a handful.
Was it really?
There were times during COVID when the number of people rough sleeping was down to a handful.
So why? Why was it down to a handful at those times?
Well, in those times, there were programs of work to literally get people off the street. It became a government priority in both times. With COVID, it was all about safety. People on the street were literally in danger of dying. And indeed, people in hostels where they're sleeping close to each other, that was dangerous as well. So the government at that time decided, with some help from the homelessness sector, to get everybody off the street. And they did. And they booked hotels, or in Cornwall, it was, holiday let caravans, and made sure people had food delivered to them. And they got literally almost everybody off the street. And then you wind forward a few years, and even the very conservative estimate, conservative small c, even the very conservative estimate of rough sleeping at 4,000 people on a typical night in England, and it's a gross underestimate, but even that figure has gone up 27% in the last year and 120% since 2010. And while it's a complex and really difficult and dangerous personal thing, the policy is straightforward. Support people off the street, have enough houses or homes that are affordable, truly affordable, and have a welfare safety net. So when things go wrong in people's lives, they don't fall right to the street. In Cornwall, there are those issues. They're exactly the same issues, social housing and the lack of joined up support for people, and the welfare safety net, because of course those aren't policies that are made in Cornwall. Cornwall has a particular issue around housing supply, because clearly it's an economy which is dependent on tourism. And it's a great destination if you can work and don't need to, work in London or work in Bristol or wherever. It's a great destination for people. And a lot of people moved. But the number of homes which are out of circulation because they're Airbnbs or they're private rented or they're someone's second home or they're a holiday let, or, the proportion of houses which are out of the system for that is huge. The level of sort of wealth and health inequalities in Cornwall is incredibly high. Wages are low, house prices are high, and that leads to Cornwall having its own homelessness and rough sleeping issue. I mean, I think the estimate from St Petrocs is about 700 people would have slept rough at some point last year in Cornwall, which is 38% higher than the previous year. So you can see it's the same set of policy issues, but it's also some very specific issues.
So I would imagine you've welcomed Prince William with open arms, the fact that he's launched this building project on his own land, on the Duchy of Cornwall land. Tell me a bit about the project and how it came about.
It's a really great project. And, Prince William's commitment to homelessness goes back years, if not decades. And his Homewards initiative is setting out around the country to demonstrate what it would take to end homelessness in particular areas. And of course, there's quite a special relationship between Cornwall and Prince William, in that Prince William, through the Duchy of Cornwall, is a major landowner. And at Nansledan, there is, actually a quite beautiful housing project being developed, not just around homelessness, but housing mixed tenure housing where everybody, whether you're in social housing, affordable housing, or just a normal private purchase, it all looks good. It all looks respectful. It all looks part of the community. It all looks of its place in Cornwall. It's a really, really amazing housing project, aside from the homelessness part of it. But if you put together, using that land and building really great, modern, sustainable homes with Prince William's commitment around homelessness, and there's a wonderful coming together there. So the plan is there will be 24 homes. I think 12 of them will start being built this year as part of that wider development. And, we talked a lot about, well, what would we use those homes for? Because ideally, and the best approach, the best way of getting someone out of homelessness is they get a permanent home. Temporary accommodation is important only in as much as it stops the emergency of being on the street. But the ideal would be permanent home. But we looked at the housing market in Cornwall and said, if we just use those houses as permanent homes, we will help 24 people. And the help for those 24 people will be amazing, and they will have a permanent home and they'll be great. But how can we help other people? And the idea we came to was, okay, it's not that we're saying they have to go into a temporary accommodation until somehow they deserve a permanent home. It's they need to go into a temporary accommodation until there is a permanent home. And when there's a permanent home, let's get people moved out to that as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, it's temporary housing in a proper home, in a normal street, and a house that looks like we're paying that person respect and not just dumping them in some awful place just because they're homeless. So straight away, they will feel safe off the street, having a home, dare I use the word normal, part of the community. I think the first set of houses near bus stops, they can get into Newquay and all those things, get to the doctors, get to the supermarket. So it's a fantastic sort of integrated with a wider housing project. And straight away, people who will be able to come off the street in Cornwall into a really, really nice looking, respectful home, and then start to build their future. Maybe work with St Petrocs on their employability, get their CV sorted out, do some vocational skills training, help them get a job so they can afford that next place, but make sure that they're safe and they see a positive future.
It is about that kind of support, isn't it? I met a gentleman at Victoria Station on my way to you today called Paul. He came over, he was trying to raise enough money to stay in a hostel tonight. Of course, nobody has much cash these days. It was very unusual. I did have a few pounds in my purse that I gave him. But I just had a chat with him, like I do often with homeless people, but particularly because I was coming to see you today. And he's from the army. He's got an HGV licence, but he's fallen down on his luck and he's got nowhere to stay at the minute. But he doesn't want to be homeless. Can I play you a little clip?
Please, yeah.
Do you find a lot of people, Paul, kind of ignore you and don't really listen?
Yeah, a lot of people. The thing that winds me up is when you approach someone, they just blank you and they just look at you like a bit of dirt. I'd rather them just turn and say, sorry, I can't help you, and I'd walk away. It just winds me up when they give you a dirty look and don't even acknowledge you. So,
what's it like when you do have to sleep rough? Is it quite frightening here in London?
Basically, I don't know if you know Wicked, the Apollo Theatre, the fire exits. The nights I don't get into the hostel, I sleep in the doorway. I go there at 11 o'clock at night because they kick out at 10:30, so you can go in the doorway at 11. I normally get about an hour and a half sleep because the buses run 24/7. People are running like going past, so you never actually fall asleep into a deep sleep. You're semi-conscious in case anything happens. Obviously, I can handle myself. But obviously, I don't want a situation where I get myself into trouble.
You see the way out of this to get some work, which is probably like a lot of people.
I spoke to my sister last week. She said, come up, and she got a spare room. She goes, you can stay up for a couple of months, but I only expect to stay there a month, get enough money working, and then obviously, even if it's just a room in a shared house, a bed sit, whatever it is, as long as I've got somewhere I can come home, put my head down. I've worked nights and that. I prefer working nights. So obviously, go back to doing lorry driving, short distance, whatever, international, I don't mind. And then obviously after a while, get enough money to put down on a flat or something. But obviously London is just ridiculous for the prices. So there's no point me starting to stay down there because it's just outrageous. The prices of rent in London is just ridiculous.
Well, listen, it was nice of you to come and speak to me today, and good luck. Good luck, Paul.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers.
Is that a familiar story?
Sadly, very, very familiar. But actually, what he was able to tell you about homelessness was just really, really important for people to hear. I mean, people have all sorts of assumptions about what happens and why people become homeless. But if you look at St Petrocs research in Cornwall, the reasons are a relationship breakdown, or family and friends you're staying with can't accommodate you anymore, or you lose your private sector rental, or you're living in fear of violence and have to leave. None of those reasons are about somebody doing a bad thing or making a wrong choice. They're about things that happen in people's lives. We're under enough pressure as it is to, make our rent, particularly since the cost of living increased so rapidly. So, with that pressure building up in people's lives, it only takes one thing to give, and homelessness becomes the consequence of that. Last time I was out with St Petrocs workers in Newquay, we met a young woman who was 24 hours away from rough sleeping. She'd been staying in a rented place which belonged to her boyfriend's mother. She split up, and the splitting up meant she was out the next day and would have been rough sleeping. And the St Petrocs worker I was with, they really understood the danger that young woman was just about to face. Rough sleeping is, it's not a lifestyle thing. It's dangerous. You're at risk of coercive relationships and violence, of everything else. And that young woman would have very, very quickly, her life would have deteriorated significantly. She may well have ended up in some kind of coercive relationship in order to get someone to stay. And the St Petrocs worker treated it like we should always treat it. It's an emergency. If someone is about to sleep on the street, it's an emergency, and it should be treated in that way. And within 3 hours, they had arranged that young woman would have a place to stay. And it had involved finding the place to stay. It had involved somebody finding a bed for that place in someone's garage, and, real innovation and rapid work, things you do in an emergency to solve a problem. They did all those things. And 3 hours later, that young woman had a place to stay. Her life will be 100% different because of that moment she met that person. Because once you're on the street, it's really, really dangerous, as the gentleman you were speaking to said.
Do you think, in a way, Jon, that people have lost a sense, or some people in our nation have lost a sense of kindness and empathy, and see people sleeping in doorways, well, even if they look down to look, as a nuisance, and make them feel invisible, rather than somebody that's truly vulnerable and needs some help? And if you can give no more help than a kind word, I kind of feel that we're living in quite unkind times.
I agree. And we find unkind reasons not to help. We'll make an assumption. I'm not going to give that person any money because they're going to go and buy drugs with it. What right do you have to make that story up about that person? And, we always said at Crisis, when you ask for things by people who are begging, first of all, it's a personal choice whether to get involved in that or not. Second thing we would say is, well, first of all, check if that person's actually in danger. And if they're in danger, call the emergency services. If they're not in danger, actually ask them what they need. But once you've asked them, give without strings attached. Once you've given that person £1 or £5, it's their £5. It's not your £5 anymore to judge how it's spent. Do it out of kindness. Do it without strings attached. And of course, if you base the interaction on kindness, you're going to have a different interaction than if you base it on that you're annoyed with them, they're in your way, they're a nuisance, you've got all sorts of preconceptions about who they are. Really a bit of kindness at the heart of our policy making and at the heart of our interactions with each other on the street.
And a bit of conversation. Way. I mean, these days, not many of us have got much cash in our pockets because we seem to have become a cashless society, which I would imagine has also had a huge impact too. But the Prince and Princess of Wales, their compassion and their true understanding really seems to shine through. And I was talking to Lois, one of your colleagues at St Petrocs, and she said that when the Prince and Princess of Wales visited some of the people at St Petrocs Help, they didn't want to leave. They were so engrossed in the stories, and that's a lovely thing, isn't it?
It certainly is. I haven't met either of them, but look at the choices they've made of the projects they back. Prince William on homelessness, and Kate on early years, and what happens to people in the very, very earliest part of their lives. They could choose anything to support, but those are things which I think are just show real compassion and show real understanding as to how we can be better as a society. I think it's a great thing. They know what they can and can't do, and they really seem to do what they can.
And we sit at UNICEF UK, but I'm just thinking in terms of homelessness, presumably children are caught up in this too when parents lose their homes.
Absolutely. The number of children living in temporary accommodation, and it puts their lives back. We've all seen the studies on, the impact of trauma as a child on the rest of your life. And it's true. If you look at people who are homeless as an adult, two things they're likely to have in common. One is poverty as a child, and two is trauma as a child. And trauma could be being homeless, being excluded from school, violence in the home. And that's not to say those things cause homelessness, but those are the things that many, many homeless adults have in common: childhood poverty and childhood trauma.
The former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who's doing incredible things with his multi-banks at the moment, like food banks, but full of returns from Amazon that he's managed to secure, which is great, said recently that Britain, he feels, is in the throes of a hidden poverty epidemic, with the worst affected households living in squalor, going without food. How bad is it? Sitting here at UNICEF, how much has your work looked at that kind of thing? And are you optimistic that potentially a change of government might help?
What Gordon Brown is saying is very, very consistent with what UNICEF is saying. UNICEF globally published a report in the autumn on child poverty in EU and OECD countries. And what it showed was that the increase in child poverty in the UK over the last 10 years was one of the worst increases of all OECD and EU countries. So what Gordon Brown is saying is borne out in the research and is a matter of fact, and it's a matter of policy as well. There are things that could be done which would quickly reduce the number of children living in poverty in the UK. For example, the 2-child limit for universal credit. If that were changed, I think it's literally hundreds of thousands of children could be lifted out of poverty. So these are matters of policy as much as, personal compassion. And UNICEF's politically neutral organisation, but there are definitely policies that could be changed, like that one, like the benefit cap, which would definitely improve the levels of poverty for children in the UK.
Have you been involved in that kind of work while you've been here?
The UNICEF UK's sort of flagship campaign, if you like, for the UK, because obviously a lot of our work is international, is a campaign called Early Moments Matters. And, we've been calling for what we just referred to as a baby and toddler guarantee. So if we're going to guarantee some levels of standards and support and so on for any group of people, surely it would be babies and toddlers, because all the research shows that who you are, where you were born, where you come from, where you live, all of those things have an impact on your future life, because you're treated differently as a baby and toddler because of those things. And surely we ought to be able to at least give a guarantee to our babies and toddlers that we're going to support them. And particularly we're looking at financial support for families. So those two areas I mentioned, the benefits cap and the 2-child limit. We're looking at mental health support for parents of very, very young children, and guaranteed access to early education and childcare. You might think those are really simple and very basic things that any society would provide, but clearly we don't. And at the moment, we've just commissioned some research with the NSPCC around barriers to access to early education for children living in poverty, because we want to be able to demonstrate, what the route map would need to be to make sure those barriers are broken and the most marginalised children have access to early education. We saw, I think there was some research came out recently about the Sure Start regime that showed that for children who attended Sure Starts and families who were involved with Sure Starts, their levels of education attainment at GCSE, so a decade later, were higher. And the biggest positive impact was felt by poorer children. So going back to that thing about, if you see the homeless adult and the thing they have in common is child poverty, we'll start to reduce some of the causal links between those things. So something like a Sure Start, comprehensive, joined up support for young children from low income backgrounds, affects their educational attainment, affects their future life, reduces the chances of them being homeless as an adult, and so on. These things are really, really important and very joined up. And they're not rocket science. Every policy point I've made in our conversation, we've done before. Not you, I didn't invent them. We've done them before and they work. We just need to do them again.
At the beginning, you said your work has been very rewarding, but also very frustrating. Does that aspect that you've just mentioned there, that we've done all of these before, does that come under the frustrating headline?
Totally. I think one of the biggest frustrations I saw was the inspirational approaches that people took to homelessness and rough sleeping during COVID were exhilarating. I mean, you don't solve homelessness by putting people in hotels, obviously. But the idea that you could say, we are going to get everybody off the street, and it happened, just really exhilarating and optimistic. And as we came towards the end of that period, this sinking feeling that we weren't going to take advantage of that opportunity and put in place policies to stop those people having to go back onto the street. And now being back at a point where rough sleeping is 120% higher than it was 14 years ago is incredibly frustrating. But I tell you, the optimism overrides the frustration because these things can be done.
And is it hard for you to leave these jobs? Because obviously you spent a long time at Crisis and are clearly still very passionate about our homelessness crisis. But now you've been helping children. I think you've been at UNICEF before as well. I think this isn't your first time at UNICEF. Yes. I know you're going to be doing wonderful stuff at Mencap, but how much of a wrench is it when you leave an organisation when clearly there's always going to be still things that need to be done in that organisation?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I think sadly, there are enough bad things to go round. So, there are enough things for as many people as want to help to be able to. So firstly, I always know that someone will follow, and whether it's here at UNICEF UK or previously at Crisis, I've left behind incredible teams of people doing incredible work. And actually you start to think, well, there comes a point when you're past your own sell-by date and you're not adding that much new value to go and move on. I have to say, though, with Mencap, the depth of the issue for people with a learning disability and the depths we've fallen to in terms of social care policy and so on, that's probably going to take a while.
So you're going to have your work cut out there.
Yes.
We realised at the beginning of our conversation before we started recording that we have the wonderful charity Seeability in common. I'm a patron of Seeability, and it looks after people with learning difficulties and with visual impairment. And I told you a story about climbing Mount Toopcal with a team from Seeability, 8 blind or visually impaired people, including the wonderful Scott Watkin, who's their head of engagement. Scott has learning disabilities, struggles with his sight, but he goes into Parliament and he talks to politicians and MPs, championing people with disabilities, learning disabilities. Really an eye-opener spending time with him on Toopcal and hearing about his daily struggles and how people perceive him, and then understanding what an asset he is and how much he brings to the table. We really need society to change, don't we? And to open their ears and eyes and start being inclusive and realise that we all bring different stuff to the table.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the best moments, for example, of my last few months has been working with UNICEF UK's Youth Advisory Board, a group of young people passionate about children's rights, and going to see the children's minister with them. And literally people say, oh, you went to meet the children's minister with the Youth Advisory Board. I'm like, no. The Youth Advisory Board went to meet the minister. I took the notes. I was in the room, but they met with the minister. And seeing that sort of thing happen is really exciting, because who knows better what young people think? I certainly don't, but young people do. And similarly at Mencap, one of the things I'm really looking forward to, they have a group of people with learning disability called the Voices Council. And they sit alongside their board of trustees, overseeing the organisation and making sure that people like me who manage charities are accountable to them as much as I'm accountable to the trustees. That's really exciting, because working alongside people, knowing that they're part of their own solution. And if all I can do as a non-disabled person is support them to have agency, then I'll have done the job.
You carry a lot of weight on your shoulders. I know you make a difference, but you also see a lot of very desperate situations, desperate people and children. How do you decompress? What's your relaxation? How do you manage to carry on doing what you're doing, but to relax and unwind and step away sometimes?
Incredibly fortunate to live in the countryside in Cornwall. The weekend, I'll be in the garden looking after my vegetable patch, or I'll be in the sea, in a quiet beach away from the tourists, just literally away from things and able to reflect and think. But to be honest, it's actually a privilege to be able to work on these causes and experience these things, as long as you're trying to do something about them, not just observing them.
I've ended every podcast recently with a question about risk. And I just wondered, in your life, working or home life or any time in your life, what's the biggest risk, Jon, that you've ever taken?
I've reflected on this. I don't think I'm a big risk taker. However, I do remember one time when I used to be chief executive of Scope, the disability charity. This was in the sort of mid to late 2000s. And they were going through a very difficult time as charity. You know, the financial situation was very difficult. We were having to focus very hard on turning the charity around. Unfortunately, we had to close some services. We're really finding it a struggle to make sure the organisation came through it. And during that time, we took on a £5 million loan while we were in quite a difficult, precarious financial position. And the £5 million loan was to invest in service innovation. So it wasn't even for a particular project. It was for our innovation project. And what that was about was trying to turn around some quite old-fashioned services while being able to have the freedom to invent the new services. So services that would support people, young people, to be included in their mainstream school instead of going off to a segregated school. Services which are about 18-year-old disabled young people having an equivalent experience to their non-disabled counterparts who would probably be in a hall of residence or sharing a flat with someone, and actually building services which enabled that to happen. And it was just about taking on such a large loan at a time when we were in quite a precarious financial position. That was probably the riskiest thing. But I tend not to take risks too much because you're taking risks with other people's lives if you're not careful.
It's been an absolute pleasure, as I knew it would be, meeting you. And I just wish you the best of luck with Mencap and keep doing what you're doing, Jon. The world needs people like you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Jon Sparkes OBE, a trustee at St Petrocs in Cornwall, Chief Executive of UNICEF UK and soon to be CEO of Mencap, talking about homelessness and the project St Petrocs is involved with the Prince of Wales. Download our podcast at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with travel writer and Voices from the Frontline podcast host Catherine Fairweather. So join me then.